As King Henry VIII of England used to say to each one of his 6 wives, I'm not going to keep you for very long. What I want to do is to share with you a little of the thinking of the World Jewish Diplomatic Corps Task Force on the Law and Policy of Armed Conflict, a task force that was recently initiated by Jewish diplomats from around the world to study, to research, to understand, and to help the Jewish Congress play a key role in countering the phenomena of lawfare, a phenomena that is of very real, we feel, strategic concern to Israel and should be of daily concern to the Jewish world as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, in its 62 years of modern statehood, Israel has not only known many wars per se, but several succeeding species of war. As one modality of war, one species of war has failed to overwhelm Israel, a process of strategic adaptation has occurred on the part of our adversaries with a new approach taken. And it is our sense that we are now in the midst of a new paradigm shift, the emergence of a new species of warfare against the state of Israel. The faster we recognize it, the more accurate our analysis, the more correct our prognosis of the threat, the protagonists, the battlefield, the time dimension of this new species of warfare, and so on and so forth, the more effective our response will be. What is lawfare? Lawfare can be described as the use and abuse of domestic and international law and institutions as a means of damaging an opponent militarily and strategically. Examples we have all heard of, the use of international humanitarian law, the use of the laws of war, the use of universal jurisdiction. Now, if it was only a war that was taking place in courts, if it was only a battle of words, I, as an Israeli, as a Jew, would have been perfectly happy to fight that war. However, I think it is critical for us to understand that lawfare does not replace violence. It supplements it, it exacerbates it, and sometimes it deliberately provokes it. It turns local tactical events into events that potentially have strategic ramifications for the state of Israel and the Jewish world as a whole. We saw that with the flotilla incident recently. Like any type of war, lawfare is animated by a certain logic. And that logic is to pursue, to persecute, to prosecute political leaders and military commanders for participating in so-called war crimes. It is to constrain political leaders and military commanders from taking just and necessary military action because of fear of such prosecutions. Lawfare seeks to promote the international diplomatic, security, economic, and cultural isolation of Israel because it understands that 21st century warfare, Israel can only maintain its qualitative advantage through strategic ties, through technological abilities, and so it tries to erode those ties. What is happening also, another dimension of lawfare, is an attempt to undermine the very credibility of the state of Israel's legal system. If we want to point out to the most pernicious aspect of the Goldstone report, I would argue that that is it. It is the Goldstone report and now the follow-up commission to Goldstone's attempt to discredit the Israeli legal system and to seek to replace its rules and procedures and justice with the so-called justice of international institutions. It is there to force what I call sovereignty undermining international intervention. It is there to impose fines and other forms of economically crippling steps. And it is there to tie up the opponent's time and other resources in a constant web of lawsuits, inquiries, fact-finding missions, and so on and so forth. In sum, the purpose of lawfare is the Gulliverization of the State of Israel. And by the way, the purpose is to neutralize the ability of Israeli leaders and military commanders from taking action even when that action is absolutely necessary. And by the way, I want to say that the Lilliputians really are the Lilliputians of this world. This effort is not driven by the giants of this world. It is driven by vile dictatorships, by unaccountable NGOs, and by cowardly academics. Why is this happening now? Why didn't we see this happen 40 or 30 years ago? Why is this happening now? Part of the answer has absolutely nothing to do with the State of Israel. It has to do with the new nature of war, so-called new wars. And I don't have very much time, so I won't go into this in detail, but there are several key features to new wars. And they afflict not only Israel, but they afflict other Western democracies struggling with insurgent, guerrilla, terrorist networks. The first and most important is that whereas old wars involved states fighting states, new wars are characterized by Western states confronting non-state actors. Whereas in old wars there was a clear distinction between combatants and civilians, today that distinction is blurred, sometimes deliberately, in order to instigate violations of international humanitarian law. Whereas in the past, norms such as the ones embodied in the Geneva Conventions were there to humanize interstate war, today the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law is being used as a politicized weapon by the so-called weak against the strong as a means of trying to reverse the symmetrical power between them. Here's an example of new wars. What you see here is a mosque in Gaza. Less than 10 yards away from it is a launching site of a Qassam missile. As I mentioned, this phenomenon is not something that we only see in Gaza. We also see it in Lebanon and other places. Hezbollah has certainly internalized the lessons of Goldstone. In the summer of 2006, it had 90% of its rockets destroyed by the Israeli Air Force. And so now Hezbollah is hiding, deliberately hiding, its weaponry within densely populated civilian areas as a means, because it knows that the Israeli army will be very careful about striking those targets, and also because it wants to drag in Israel into causing civilian casualties. And as I mentioned, this is not just a problem for Israel. It is also a problem for the United States, for Canada, for Australia, for Germany, and so on and so forth. Okay, I don't have a lot of time to enter into this, but this is a key dimension of what our task force is trying to do. We perceive lawfare to be exacerbated not only by the new nature of war, but also by the antiquity, some would say the quaintness, of the old rules that were designed to regulate interstate war. And you have some examples of where the existing legal lacunas are. When the Geneva Conventions were drafted, when the protocols to the Geneva Conventions were drafted, they were drafted for member states. Nobody imagined that non-state actors would have such profound power, that a group like Hezbollah would have 45,000 missiles, that Secretary Gates has mentioned that Hezbollah has more military power today than most governments around the world. So there are big lacunas in the laws of war that we need to deal with. Why now? I want to argue that lawfare is not only exacerbated by new wars and the out-of-datedness, if you like, of the existing international legal framework to regulate conflict, but also by what I would call global surveillance warfare. It's that entire web that we've been talking about, not just the United Nations and the European Union and the International Committee of the Red Cross, but developments in international criminal law, the development, the proliferation of universal jurisdiction, the seepage of international human rights law into rules that govern war, the development of precision weaponry and monitoring mechanisms that will very, very soon enable the International Committee of the Red Cross to come and say, why don't you, the Israeli army, put a little camera on the lapel of every single Israeli soldier that goes into battle so that we can monitor what that Israeli soldier is doing at any given moment. And of course, the incredible explosion of viral media that is, it used to be the case that you sat at home and you waited for the results of the war to be announced to you. Today we see wars happening in real time, and our adversaries have understood that. This is what we're facing, global surveillance warfare. Okay, just very briefly to wrap up. Our task force engages a global network of Jewish diplomats with expertise in law, in international relations, media, and politics. As a friend of mine, Gidi Greenstein, says, it takes a network to fight a network. We're facing a network. States alone will not be able to counter this new threat. Civil society, and this is where the World Jewish Congress is so important, and the network of the World Jewish Congress is so important. Civil society and networks will have to counter this network. We are focused on learning, on conceptualization, of trying to understand the nature of this threat, which is quite complex. We want to serve as a hub for gathering information on lawfare, for assessing its threat, and for understanding how to counter it. Just an example of recent learning. Here you see some members of the task force meeting with Professor Erwin Kotler, former Minister of Justice of Canada, in a recent conference in London. Erwin was very gracious, and he said, you know, I'm over 70 years old. Alan Dershowitz, if I may say so, is also over 70 years old. We really need to train the next generation of lawyers who can take this battle forward in an increasingly complex international environment. Our overarching goals are to develop a critical mass of experts in legal, international relations, media, and politics. This is very much an interdisciplinary effort. We need to engage young professionals from all around the world in strategies of diplomacy to counter the abuses that we see. We want to be able to know enough about this so that we're able to affect popular and public opinion through writing op-eds, writing academic articles, and speaking at various international fora. And in the longer term, we want to be able to inform and advise governments, NGOs, and institutions about the initiatives, about the challenges of delegitimation and lawfare. And we want to be able to respond, as President Lauder has mentioned, the role of lawyers in responding and being proactive in countering this. If Jews can't win legal battles, then I don't know what we can win. We need to train a next generation of young lawyers who will be able to have expertise in this area and represent us strongly. We also want to serve you. We want to serve the communities. We want to serve the regions. We want you to see us as a resource that you can use in order to inform your communities and in order to counter the growing threat of lawfare. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to end by inviting to the podium Dr. Ephraim Halevi, the former head of the Mossad, National Security Advisor, Israeli ambassador to the European Union, and now the head of the Shasha Center for Strategic Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. But before I do that, I want to wish each and every one of you a Shana Tova Umetuka, a year of health, growth, joy, strength, and peace. Shana Tova.